Welcome again to our online Bible study here at Pine Valley Church of Christ. And we continue this week our study in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's important that as we continue on through this book, that we always continue to remember his final conclusion and thoughts as this student of the teacher is reflecting on and writing down the things that he has learned. And of course, the things that the teacher has learned for himself in his own life, using the wisdom that has been given to him by God. But at the very end, after going through some very depressing and pessimistic view of life itself, he says, in the end, hey, here is the conclusion of the matter: fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. And as I mentioned last week, the word duty that's in the NIV here is not part of the Hebrew. It just says it is the whole of man. This is what gives us meaning and hope to live as our Creator has given us to live. And we'll see that come into play again here today. Let me bring up our screen share. And we also looked last week at how as he's began those first 11 verses of chapter 1, he starts with this very skeptical, pessimistic look at life under the sun. And that's an important phrase for us to remember, that he is comparing life under the sun. He uses that phrase over 30 times throughout this book. He's comparing that to life with the God who is in heaven. And so that is the contrast. And so we must always understand when he's talking about under the sun, he is talking about this very secular look at the world that focuses only on human beings and our understanding and our wants and desires versus what God has created us to be. And he basically says in this opening section, life under the sun is utter futility. It's the way the Jewish Publication Society translates that phrase, vanity, vanity, because nothing ever seems to change. Sun comes up, the sun goes down, human beings remain the same. They were selfish and sinful before the flood. They have been selfish and sinful since the flood, because that's what we choose to be. And so the world just continues on in this utter futility. And now that we come to verse 12 of chapter 1, the teacher himself speaks in the first person, and again refers to himself as king over Israel in Jerusalem. And there's a lot of connections through here, even though the name Solomon is not ever used in the book. There are just too many connections to his life, the things that he did and was involved in, for it not to be him, even though it seems to be that a student has brought all of this material together and collected it for us, just like there was a group that collected all of his proverbs at a different time. He says, I devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. What a heavy burden God has laid on men. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is twisted cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I thought to myself, look, I have grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. And then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly, but I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow, and the more knowledge, the more grief. He introduces this phrase that he's going to use several times through the next 4 or 5 chapters, in the idea of we're chasing after the wind, or the Jewish Publication Society says pursuing the wind. The Hebrew root of the word also carries the connotation of tending, as if you would a uh, tending sheep, if you were tending cattle. Those, and those animals you can take care of. You can rope a cow and uh, lead them where they need to go, or a horse, or anything like that. But you can't do that to the wind. It's I've been involved in tornadoes in Texas and here in North Carolina. I've seen huge dust storms in West Texas. I have been in hurricanes here, and the wind just has this power and direction all its own. It cannot be redirected. It can't be controlled. And that's the imagery that he's drawing on here, that this is life under the sun, this secular look at life and the world. Just shows that there's nothing really that we can do to find any real meaning or find any real control over our own lives and what happens to us. And he has, in these first few verses at the end of chapter 1, he states his conclusion that life is a burden. God has put a heavy burden on individuals, and he doesn't explain that burden just yet. That will come at the end of chapter 2. But it's a burden to live in this world and to think about it. And he uses the imagery of what is twisted can't be straightened, and what is lacking or what is not there can't be counted. It's beyond understanding. It is the chasing or the roping of the wind. And he says, and I had gained all this wisdom and knowledge throughout my life, and it doesn't change it. It does help, and he's going to talk about that more in chapter 2. But it doesn't really change the way the world is going and the things that we have to deal with. And so that's his conclusion that he lays on us here at the beginning of this section. And even concludes with those interesting words that with much wisdom comes much sorrow. In other words, as he understands even more how this world works and how human beings are in their nature, it brings much sorrow to think about that. And the more knowledge, the more grief. It just can be something that is completely depressing and lead to this very skeptical look at the world around us, and leading to being very skeptical about God and who he is and how we need to respond to him. It says, so I've given you my conclusion. Now let me share some more observations with you that are very important that prove my conclusion. So beginning in the first 11 verses of chapter 2, he says, I gave myself over to pleasure, and this also proved meaningless. And he talks about the pursuit of pleasure and projects, and undertook great projects, building houses, planting vineyards, gardens, parks, planted all kinds of trees, reservoirs of water. I bought male and female slaves. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. And I acquired men and women singers and a harem, as well the delights of the heart of a man. All these things that we think are so fulfilling in and of themselves do not provide us with anything of real happiness or feeling of accomplishment or worth. He had it all. We know at one point from First Kings, I think it's in chapter 9, it talks about that the surrounding countries were paying 666 talents of gold every year to him in tribute. That equals almost 50,000 pounds. And imagine what that would be worth in today's dollars. He had that. He accomplished all these great building projects. He acquired wives and concubines. We know he had 700 wives, 300 concubines. He pursued everything that would bring pleasure, or at least so he thought, to his flesh and to his life. And in the end, it didn't really help. He concludes that section, verses 10 and 11. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for my labor. And when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. And we look at that list and we think, wow, that was a lot gained there. And yet, when he applied all of this wisdom and looked at the way the world is, he looks at it much more from the pessimistic or skeptical point of view that this didn't really help. It didn't bring me the happiness or the meaning in my life that he was really pursuing. And he goes on in the next few verses that now wisdom is a better life, but you still die. And just like the fool dies, you will die. All of us do. That is one of those non-negotiables of life. That is, unless we are alive when Jesus returns, we will all die, whether we're wise or foolish. Now, he says wisdom is better. Verse 13, I saw that wisdom is better and folly just as light is better than darkness. Wisdom gives you a way to see the world, to find a path, to move forward as if walking in light. But still, you face the same fate as the fool. This leads him back to thinking about all that money and wealth that he had acquired. And beginning in verse 17, comes back around to this other observation. And when you die, someone else gets your stuff. It is no longer yours. You can't take it with you. And you don't know if that person's going to be wise or foolish in dealing with that. And then when they die, it passes on to somebody else if they haven't wasted it all. So here are his observations of this life around him. And, we look at our world, and especially in America, these are, the pursuit of pleasure and wealth seems to be what almost everybody is focusing on. Just enjoy life, eat what you want, drink what you want, try to get as much money as you can to buy the things that you want. This is what we tend to focus on as the American dream. And Solomon reminds us, all of this is just a chasing after the wind or trying to rope the wind. It cannot be accomplished. It cannot do these things on its own. Fortunately, when we get down through verse 20 and 23, here's his final conclusion through all of this. So he returns to his original conclusion and expands on it. My heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. For a man may do his work with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then he must leave all he owns to someone who has not worked for it. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. What does a man get for all the toil and anxious striving which he has labors under the sun? All his days his work is pain and grief, and even at night his mind does not rest. This too is meaningless. And so he says, let me reiterate, all this really brings to a person's life is despair, anxiety, and sleepless nights. If that's what we stay focused on, it will lead to a very skeptical and pessimistic outlook on life. And this is what it will lead to, because we're so worried about these things under the sun, not putting them in their proper perspective. Fortunately, starting in verse 24, he says there is hope. There is a way to find happiness. And he mentions the basics of what he has just said is worthless, but in a different light. A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. There's what he's just said is not worth anything. It's a chasing after the wind. But here is the qualifying statement. This too I see is from the hand of God, for without him who can eat or find enjoyment? To the man who pleases God, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. There is a glimmer of hope when we put it in its right perspective. He says we can eat, drink, and enjoy life because God wants us to. He didn't create us to put us on this earth to be miserable. He wants us to be able to enjoy the life that he has given us. When we understand and put everything in the perspective that this is a gift from God, when we are living that life that he talks about at the end with his conclusion of revere God and obey his commands, we live within that realm of the kind of life God wants us to live. We can be involved in many of the things that the world is involved in and find real happiness because it is a gift from God. To the man or person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But here then at the end, he returns to the burden. Here's the burden of life under the sun. To the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. It just becomes that burden. I used the illustration Sunday of my son working one summer at the adhesive company I was employed by at the time. And he had to spend some of his days just filling one glue bottle after another by hand. Think about large jugs of Elmer's glue. And it was just take a bucket, fill the bucket, put a lid on the bucket, put the bucket on a pallet, get another bucket, and then repeat the whole process just over and over again. And it was so tedious. And he hated having to do that. And he didn't understand how these guys could do this every day, week after week. And I reminded him that this was the job they had. This is the way they were paying, taking care of their families, paying the bills, getting food on the table. And there's nothing dishonorable about that. But this is life under the sun. It's just that tedious one thing, just over and over again. The point that he made back in the first 11 verses of chapter 1, just nothing ever changes. And especially humans and the way in which they live and think under the sun. And this is the burden. And I think it's put there, and he's going to explore this as we move along, to cause people to look for the alternative. Where can they find happiness? Where can they find meaning? It is a life that is a gift from God when we put our faith in him, when we worship him and revere him and live in obedience to him, because he is our creator and he knows what's best for us, and he knows what will give us meaning and happiness. And he's going to talk about various ways in which that will be applied as we move forward from here. But let's not forget that final conclusion. And even as a part of that, and we go back to verse 11, the words of the wise in chapter 12, the words of the wise are like goads, their collected sayings like firmly embedded nails given by one shepherd, which is an ancient reference, illustration of God. These are given by him, so be warned, and of making any addition to them. For of the making of many books there is no end, but much study wearies the body. You can find a do-it-yourself or self-improvement book, video, YouTube, just, anywhere you look, there's somebody saying, I can show you how to do this. I can help you find more meaning in your life. I can help you make more money. I can help you do this or that or whatever it is. And it says, it's not there. Or you find it is in what has been revealed to us by God through his prophets, and especially through his son, who was his incarnation, God in the flesh, showing us the way that this is how you live. And Jesus exhibited a life that was focused on others and serving and giving, even to the point of dying for our sins, and warned people to make sure that they were uh, storing up treasures in heaven and not just on earth. He never says that the money or the items themselves are evil, but if we let it control us rather than us control them, it becomes a terrible problem. It pulls us away from God, and we lose sight of him and what he wants us to do. And so, Jesus tells the parable in Luke 12 of the man who had a great harvest. He brings it all in. He sees how wonderful the harvest was that year, and his barns aren't big enough, and so he builds bigger barns, and he stores all of his grain, and he pats himself on the back for how great he is and what he has done. And God says, "You fool, this very night your life will be taken from you." And it is. And his stuff goes to somebody else. He goes on to tell his disciples, so remember, keep God in the picture. Trust him. Know that he loves you. He wants you to be happy. He wants you to have clothing. He wants you to have things to eat. He will, in some way, help you provide for you what you need. What we must do in Luke 12:31 is seek his kingdom. There is Jesus bringing us back into the full application of what Solomon is trying to reveal to us here. We must seek his kingdom, and God will add all these things also. That is his promise, and we must believe that, because it is what he has revealed to us and not the wisdom of men. So thank you for being part of our class. We're going to continue on next week with chapter 3, that powerful picture of here's how the world turns. There's a time for life, there's a time for birth, there's a time for death. That is just, we go through all this, and it's this chapter has been the influence for songs and poems and various other things, because they're such powerful pictures. And we'll pick up looking at that chapter 3 next week. Until then, please stay safe. God bless you, and may he continue to be with us as we seek to serve him and one another in love.